Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about vampires in the MCU. This is kind of something I've been sitting on for a while because I was listening to a podcast and someone had kind of brought up, like, what are vampires going to be like in the MCU? Like, have they always been here? Like, how are they going to get introduced? And obviously I had a multitude of thoughts, and especially because there was the episode 7 of She-Hulk, the retreat episode, and there's Saracen, who was like, oh, I'm a vampire, but he was out and about in the day. So you're like, is he actually a vampire, or is he just a guy that thinks he's a vampire? Because some of that crew that was with him are mutants, so not less Saracen's kind of like a mutant type character who just has qualities similar to a vampire but not actually is a vampire. Because he does talk about, like, oh, he has some dad issues, so we don't really know what that's all about. I mean, it's something I've talked about fairly recently because there's a lot of vampire stuff currently airing TV show wise and stuff. A lot of things have their own vampire fiction, so like what a vampire is capable of, what they can do, and just their whole circumstances changes depending on whoever's writing it and stuff like that. I'm sure the same thing applies in the comics and stuff. But what kind of made me think, because my initial thought was like, okay, so what are vampires going to be like in this universe? And part of me was wondering, if you've ever seen the show Van Helsing on Sci-Fi, I kind of thought more along those lines. Another example to kind of put in more perspective, it's kind of similar to like those grotesque vampires you got in Blade 2, like something of that ilk. Because basically in Van Helsing, if you've never seen it, I'll kind of break it down. It's not really spoilerish, but basically vampires are broken down into different categories. There's like the lower ones, they're called ferals. They're basically like, they're like essentially zombie vampires. They're just like driven by their instinct of, like, they can't even like have human speech and stuff like that. They are just legitimately like mindless zombies. Then you have like those above the pharaohs who are a little bit more like, oh, have their faculties about them. They're like more like humans. They can think and stuff like that. So they're like the next level above. And then you have like the older vampires who are basically like, hey, like we've been around for a very long time and we're stronger than like your average vampire, and we do have our human intellect. And even above them, they were like elders. So like there being a hierarchy to vampires, I think would be really interesting. It's been so long since I've seen any of the Blade movies. Obviously, I know Dracula is a thing, both obviously in the comics, and obviously he was the main antagonist of 3, but I don't remember like there being necessarily a hierarchy, because like to my recollection in 1, like most vampires looked human, and then once you had the more like monstrous ones in 2. I could definitely, it'd be really interesting, especially with Saracen. You could imply like there is a hierarchy, that maybe Saracen's on the like the higher hierarchy, where you have like, you can have like your Blade 2 vampires, but you could also have like your more traditional, like, you know, True Blood, the Vampire Diaries type of vampires, or even like Let the Right One In, or The Interview with the Vampire. Use those 2 specific examples because they're because the TV shows are currently airing and stuff like that. So you could have like all those different vampires. Something I also think is interesting too, because like one of the first time we heard vampire was in Loki. I think it was Mobius was saying like, oh, like we've had to like prune certain things. He's like this, that, Titans, vampire. So part of me wonders, is that specifically like, oh, because these vampires ended up causing like an issue in the timeline and they changed some stuff and they shouldn't have done that, so we reset the timeline with the vampires in it? Or are vampires themselves actually a byproduct of something going wrong? So did he prune vampires because like you're not supposed to exist at all, and because of everything going down with Kang and the timeline splintering like they did at the end of Loki, maybe that's how we make it so like, no, vampires have always existed, but it's like because the timeline splintered, and now we're in a situation where they shouldn't have existed at all, but now they do and continue to exist in like a particular timeline because of it. And maybe it kind of inadvertently backdates, like, oh, you know, I mean, it also depends on when they were, like, say like, oh, vampires came about in 1000 AD, and that ended up being like, yeah, like that timeline then got pruned, but now it's like because everything's splintering, it's like, yep, and now it's we kind of inadvertently backdate vampirism in this universe that way to some extent. That's me kind of overthinking it, because I mean, Especially if you go with like the Van Helsing route. Like the whole premise behind that is vampires existed the entire time. They were just myths and legends until we got to the point where basically a volcano erupted, ash covered the sky, and vampires were able to just be out and about. It was the whole premise behind Van Helsing is instead of a zombie apocalypse, it's a vampire apocalypse. But like I said, like in that universe, like vampirism is kind of treated like zombieism. Like you can infect someone by biting them, and it's literally like zombieism in that regard. Just takes one bite, you know? So I'd be curious to see if they would take that approach to it, or would they once again keep it more traditional vampirism type of approach. Also, do vampires shapeshift? Is that something they're going to tackle or not? Also, because this is post Werewolf by Night, obviously we know that there are hunters in this world, so that could be also why vampires are maybe on a borderline extinct species, because like, right, you have Blade out there, but you also have other hunters. That could be something we could see in the Blade movie, where Blade ends up interacting with other hunters out there. And obviously what that means in a world, like, does Blade, obviously he's mainly a vampire hunter, but we know there's other supernaturals out there, so does he hunt them too? Does this mean he'd eventually cross paths with like Man-Thing and Jack, aka Werewolf by Night? So questions like that have now been set up to be like, okay, so how would that kind of pay off when we do eventually get to Blade? Question people have also asked too, like, are you going to start with Dracula, or are you going to kind of build up to Dracula like you did basically in the original Blade trilogy? People also, obviously, the conversation about violence and stuff like that, it's like, well, depending on how you handle the vampirism, like the death of a vampire, it's like, right, them turning to ash and stuff like that, like I think that'd be fine, like you slicing up a vampire and them turning to ash, because it won't get super bloody. I mean, once again, it just depends on like what approach to vampirism like you take. And I'd assume this is going to be pretty deep into Blade's history when we do get there. Like, he's been doing this a while, you know, and also like, where does the Eternals thing happen in your timeline? And, you know, are we going to be picking up with, or like the whole Black Knight situation at the end of Eternals? Like, is that going to play into the Blade movie at all? Is that just going to be like a tag at the very end of the movie? Because the question is, well, now with Werewolf by Night, are they setting up a very Midnight Suns kind of supernatural squad? You know, obviously they've kind of thrown Moon Knight in there, Werewolf, Jack Russell, Werewolf by Night, Man-Thing. There's talks, obviously, like, you know, if they, depending on what they decide to do with Ghost Rider, that could be a part of that situation as well. Kind of like, once again, leaning more into the more supernatural side, because we have been going like ground earth based and like cosmic based back and forth, but the supernatural side tends to be the one that hasn't been really touched on yet. So just curious to see what that all looks like in the long run. But obviously my main focus of this was just vampirism and what that kind of is going to look like going forward in the MCU. Just a little, like, you know, acknowledgments we've seen here and there so far. Obviously, these are my thoughts. I'd love to get to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Based on the different vampire fictions out there, is there a particular type of vampirism that you would want Marvel Studios to kind of lean more towards? What specifically and why? I'd love to get to know your thoughts, your different perspectives on what vampirism probably speaks more to you. Really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.